Hello, Jill. Welcome back to Meet the Research and Meet the Researcher. It's great to have you back on our video segment for NSFM Next Gen, where we are trying to put a face to the research and discuss research that is, in this case, absolutely timely and very topical.
Okay, well, thank you very much for inviting me again, because hopefully I didn't scare people off too much last time.
No, I'm sure you didn't.
Theoretical discussion.
Could you just give us a brief introduction for the people who haven't seen the other video of who you are? Just maybe 1 or 2 sentences.
Okay, well, I'm a Professor of Financial Management in Sheffield University, and I work in an area which some people don't see as connected to finance, which is biodiversity in nature, ecosystems, ecological issues, and how they connect to the financial markets.
All right, thank you very much. So let's just dive into the paper. So the paper is currently at Manuscript stage, but it's submitted. And to basically start with, what's the problem? No, but what is the specific problem that you're trying to discuss in the paper?
Okay, well, I've been working, as you know, on institutional investor engagement on issues to do with biodiversity, etc., for quite some time. And I've been very interested in looking at how the financial markets can incorporate biodiversity more. So, for example, into engagement processes, but also into bonds, into banking, into all aspects of the financial markets. And when COVID-19 started and we were suddenly in lockdown, it was about 3 or 4 weeks into lockdown, I didn't really think that I needed to do any research in the area of COVID-19. So we had a few emails from work saying, obviously this is very important, that we should be, turning our research attentions to it. I hadn't really thought about it until one of my co-authors, Abir Hassan, who I met relatively recently, sent me an email and said, we need to do something on COVID-19. And I thought, I don't really get this, And I woke up one morning and suddenly it all just became so obvious that everything I was doing was connected to COVID-19 because of the links between animal transmission to humans and the way that arises because of biodiversity. So basically, I've spent the last 3 to 4 months, working flat out, trying to untangle this issue and trying to show...
Could you walk us maybe slightly through this issue and how they are connected, just for our viewers who might not have come across it?
Well, this is the thing, and I've been doing a lot of webinars around this as well, because people are desperate to understand the linkages, and they've not been obvious at all. To me, it's quite obvious now, but it's not obvious to everybody. So, basically, if you look at how this started, this pandemic, it appears that it's from the transmission of the disease from animals, and probably from a pangolin or a bat, through various, ecological chains that I don't understand, because obviously I'm not a scientist, to humans. And they think, I don't know whether time will prove a particular source, but it seems to be from wet markets in Wuhan, and from somebody at some point eating some type of bat or a pangolin and contracting the disease and passing it to somebody else. It literally is one case of transmission, from what I understand, from one animal to one human. Now, okay, that's a biological issue. It's created a pandemic, which is still continuing to accelerate, as far as I can understand, around the world. It's by no means under control. And you could say, well, that's all environmental, that's all, biodiversity, ecology, but actually it's financial. Businesses are collapsing all over the world. Governments are trying to support people, support business, a terrible financial impact. But what I realised, as I say, in this sort of sudden moment, is that the frameworks that have been developing for the academic environment, and also hopefully trying to roll out into implementation for what we call extinction accounting and extinction engagement, are already a risk management system in place for protecting us, as in humanity, against things like pandemics. So if people follow the extinction engagement framework, if shareholders take account of species extinction and biodiversity and all of these things, that lessens the risk of these types of human transmissions. So that's where it started from. I suddenly realised this, it was an implicit framework already there for protecting us against this type of thing.
So to slightly summarize the
connection.
Framework. So it's basically that the intrusion of humans into nature is leading to a higher overlap of, if you want to say, the human world and the natural world, which then increases the likelihood of contracting diseases from animals. And this is happening through deforestation, for example.
Exactly.
It's happening in operations like mining operations. Would that be the link, the direct link, if you want?
There are several links. There seem to be multiple links. I mean, obviously, as a non-scientist, I've been reading as much as I can to understand these things. So deforestation is one, because you're giving animals less space to live in and forcing closer contact. Mining, for example, I understand, was the way in which Ebola diseases were transmitted, because people are going into the forests and getting close to monkeys or whatever the transmitter is.
That was originally in the 90s, I guess.
That's right. And if you look at the way that businesses are encroaching further and further into natural rainforest, for example, that's one way that these transmissions happen. But from what I understand, also there are connections to climate change, deforestation generally. There's connections with lack of biodiversity, basically all the things that we worry about to do with the current extinction crisis, mass species extinctions. It is reducing genetic pools of animals. It's forcing animals to come out of places and come closer to human contact. And all of these things. It's just basically, the rape of nature as we're seeing it is destroying the natural environment, destroying species, which is horrible in itself, but it's also now clear that it's putting humans at risk, not just because of collapse of ecosystem services, which is where I started from with this work some time ago. For example, pollinators, the collapse in bee populations and the collapse of pollinator populations is causing risks for the human food chain, which people didn't see. So, going back to the work we did on bees in about 5-6 years ago, when we published that work, people used to laugh about my research area. And it was only when we did a few investor-facing events, which I remember you helped us set up with Hermes, for example, where I spoke to a room full of investors, and suddenly you start to see those linkages, the financial linkages, the reason why shareholders should be worried about these things, because they represent a financial risk.
And talking about shareholders, so for the paper, for this new paper, you talked to investors about, what did you ask them? And did you have the feeling that they are aware of the financial risk that you just described?
I think, yes. To answer that, I think, yes, they are aware very much that there is some sort of risk around biodiversity. Now, if you look at the leaders, obviously I can't mention the names, but some of the people that I have been interviewing the last few months are what I would call the leaders, the front line of responsible investment, and people who are very enlightened. Yes, they understand it, absolutely. They can see the linkages and they can see why biodiversity is a financial issue, but they're also passionate personally about these issues in relation to other things like human well-being, our surroundings, the future generations, our children, what the world's going to be like, and of course, species extinctions and biodiversity. So, yes, part of them do. Other parts of the financial services and the investment community, from what I can see, are beginning to see it as an issue. They understand that it's important. They don't understand why. So I've had many people asking me to talk to them over the last few months to explain what these linkages are and why it's so important. And, we interviewed about 28 people altogether, very senior people from all around the international institutional investment community in the UK, but also in Italy and in South Africa. And particularly the Italian financial community are extremely enlightened, I would say, quite far ahead, if I dare say, some of the UK investment institutions. They are, I think, having been to Italy quite a few times and working with a colleague there, Federica Doni, we're very connected with the financial community in Milan. And they really are so committed to green issues in finance and climate change issues and biodiversity increasingly. So, something's happened over the last year, I would say, in this area. And I was aware of that already, partly because of the work we've been doing. But COVID, as this paper says, has completely blown this area out of the water as far as I'm concerned. It's acted as a catalyst because it's made people realise the connections between biodiversity and human life. So one of the things that we say in the paper, and I think this is so important, was actually my daughter who made me realise this. We were sitting talking about it a couple of weeks ago. Biodiversity has been seen as a rather minor part of E in ESG, a minor environmental issue. Climate change has been the dominant issue. And what COVID has done has actually shifted biodiversity from the E to the S, because suddenly it's a massive factor for people and human health and human survival. And, we don't know where this pandemic is going to end. It's not actually going away. We only need a couple more of these, and you're starting to look at, the collapse of human societies and populations from the point of view of the human species. So I think...
So suddenly human extinction becomes something that is not abstract anymore.
Exactly. And I think that's what people are realising. I mean, how can you have a situation, if you think 6 months ago, where everybody that we know all over the world, academics that we talk to, everybody is sitting in their houses talking to each other like this? I mean, it is absolutely unprecedented. It's when you actually think about it, it's hard to believe what has happened.
You would not have believed it a year ago.
It's like a sci-fi movie. It's like the most awful sci-fi movie, but usually in those sort of American sci-fi movies where they have, pandemics and viruses and whatever, there's a nice sort of end. I'm not sure with this where we're going at the moment. I mean, certainly if you look at Brazil and the United States, the situation is horrific. It's completely out of control. And
we're only starting to see the start of the pandemic in the global south.
Yeah.
Which I think will have a devastating consequences.
Completely. I mean, I think you're looking at millions of people. And it's okay to say, well, this is just because of eating pangolin or whatever, but it's not. It's symptomatic of this collapse of our biodiversity around the world, our destruction of nature through business, just overpopulation by humans, the whole thing. I mean, I've had lots of meetings with the investment community, and people have suggested to me that maybe this is nature's way of rebalancing populations. And that's a horrible, horrible thought. Almost a nature's way of actually saying, controlling as they do with
also, other sites. To me, it sounds like shifting responsibility and accountability to the abstract nature, whatever that might be. While it's not nature. It's human activity, as we have talked about in the beginning of our segment. But it's human activity that we can pinpoint, and that is often linked to business.
You are quite
business models, even. Yeah.
Yes, that's absolutely right. And I think, I suppose, in a way, it's when you see humanity becoming self-destructive. Really, it's almost like self-destruction, as you say. If you try starting to say, oh, well, it's nature's way of doing this, then it is shifting the blame effectively, which I think is a very good point. But so basically that's where the papers come from. Yeah. I suddenly realised that the extinction engagement framework that we published a few years ago, if that was followed by the investment community all over the world, then this type of thing would be less likely to happen. So the argument really is that for investors to engage on biodiversity, species extinction, habitat loss, deforestation, all of these issues, implicitly holds or contains a risk management for protecting against pandemics. Mm-hmm. But what I wanted to do with this paper is to actually make that explicit in an investor engagement framework.
And how do you do this in the paper?
Well, what I wanted to try and do was to find what I've called intervention points, where investors can engage with companies through dialogue and engagement to reduce the risk of pandemics. So how do you find those intervention points? Those intervention points are basically questions. They're questions that investors can ask. So we've already got a set of questions from the work that we've done before on how to engage on species extinction and biodiversity. And what I wanted to do was to try and extend that and explicitly bring questions in on pandemic risk. Mm-hmm. And it's been really, really fascinating, complicated, and hopefully practically useful as well. And certainly, having talked to some of the investors after we finished the project and I sent them a copy of the paper, I think these things are actually useful for them going forward. So, for example, one question that we came up with, it sounds so obvious now, how do you protect against wildlife trafficking or poaching of endangered species throughout the value and supply chain? So that's something that an investor can ask a company. And what we've suggested here is the types of industries that applies to. So the best example is if you think about the shipping industry or the airline industry. So, they could say to them, how are you ensuring security around these types of wildlife trafficking? Because it's obviously not good enough because things are getting through. So that would be one industry that investors can target. And it's just practically looking at intervention points which could stop the risks or prevent the risks or reduce the risks of transmission. I mean, other questions that we got out of the research was, for example, how do you ensure that every part of your value chain, supply chain, takes precautions to avoid cross-species contamination from animals to employees, customers and other stakeholders? And of course, if you're thinking about the mining industry, as we said earlier, the food industry, how can you make sure that your employees are not at risk from transmission? And this is interesting, Chris, because then you start thinking about things like legal liability. Suddenly, biodiversity issues and these types of issues of wildlife trafficking, etc., become something that's not contained with environmental damage or, affecting endangered species, which there are acts and legal issues around, but it suddenly becomes something that affects human life. So if you have
basically moved from E to S, but also to G, like the moment we are in the legal frameworks.
Exactly, that's exactly what we're arguing, and what you start to see. And I've got a lawyer friend that I'm working with, trying to write something on this. What you're starting to see is that suddenly companies have a responsibility for employees for life in terms of what can transmit. So if they're putting people at danger through the mining industry and those people suddenly have this transmission of one of these deadly diseases like Ebola or COVID or whatever, then there's a legal liability around human rights issues and human protection. And, I see this as being something really massive. And again, it gives you a much stronger rationale for investors to be interested in protecting biodiversity and for companies. It's not all about airy-fairy, look after the animals, save the planet, that sort of thing. It's not all soft and fluffy. You're looking at harsh financial realities. The implications of what's happening with COVID-19 on businesses, but also issues of legal liability. I mean, for example, universities, if one was forced, which I'm sure is not going to happen, to go and do face-to-face teaching in October, and you contract this thing because of that environment, the university has a legal liability. And I think this is something that people are only just starting to actually think about. Same with students. I mean, if you sort students in an environment, so it's not just in the biodiversity issue, it obviously goes through the whole system, making sure that social distancing takes place. Investors need to be asking companies how they're preparing for transmission to social distancing, etc., to make sure that their employees and stakeholders are safe, customers, etc. The whole thing has been, as I say, the whole thing has just been blown out of the water with COVID. All of the attention on biodiversity is suddenly so much more urgent.
Yeah. I think it's really interesting, especially when you talk about legal liability. It's something that is now to be defined in this context. And I think, as you mentioned, universities are still looking into it and businesses are looking into it, which shows the complexity attached to what used to be a fluffy topic of biodiversity.
Exactly.
To address the elephant in the room, or one of the elephants in the room, like looking at the title of your paper, you mentioned Plato. So how does that fit into the paper and to engagement?
Okay, well, one of the books that I have read over the years is this one, Ulrich Beck's Risk Society. And as I said about Goffman's work, I really think it's something which everybody should read in our area if we're interested in anything to do with social construction of reality, etc. It's absolutely brilliant. And I went back to it recently, and he talks about invisible threats. So he talks very much, Beck, about ecological threats, environmental threats, pollution, things which he says are invisible to us that we don't know are there, things which are around us which are deadly and we don't know how they're going to affect us. And of course, I suddenly looked at this and I thought, in a way, he's got a premonition about things like coronavirus, COVID-19, and these types of threats, which he didn't know at the time would happen, because he was writing this in the early 1990s. He talks about dangerous hostile substances that lie concealed between harmless facades. And it just suddenly became obvious that this is exactly what we're seeing. So, I suppose some of us think about things like biodiversity risks and diseases and, pollution, because that's our research area. But most people in society before COVID-19 were going to the shops, wandering around, going to different parts of the world, eating different things, trying things that they might not have had before, like puffer fish or, from markets, all of these things. It's like everybody thought life was okay. Everybody thought that life would go on as normal forever. They didn't expect anything like this. And suddenly what COVID-19 has done is open a different perspective of reality for us. It's shown us what Beck refers to as the shadow kingdom, a sort of second reality that was invisible but now isn't. And that's all connected to biodiversity loss, species extinction. People didn't know probably about trafficking of endangered species. They didn't know that people ate pangolins. All of this has been going on and it's been hidden or ignored. Either people don't know or they don't want to know. So that's what I was thinking about. And what Beck does is he talks about Plato's allegory of the cave, which I have to say I hadn't read. I'd heard of it, I hadn't read it. So I went and read it. And it's brilliant. I mean, there's this person talking to you from, hundreds of years BC in a way which is perfectly modern. And the more I looked at it, the stranger it became. So basically, very simply, he's talking about, it's a dialogue between two friends, and they're actually talking about enlightenment through education, I think. That's what I understand. But what they're saying is that, he says, imagine that there are prisoners sitting in a cave. So all their life, they've been looking at the back of the cave. They can't turn around and look outside the cave. So they've spent their whole lives looking at a blank wall, basically. Outside the cave, there is a wall and lots of light, obviously all the light's coming in. And the wall is just high enough to mean that anybody who walks behind the wall doesn't cast a reflection on the wall. So the wall is just above human height, I suppose. Yeah. But what the prisoners see is they see the things that the people are carrying. So they're carrying all these objects. They might be statues, they might be animals, they might be all sorts of things. So the reality that the prisoners see basically is the objects that, or are the objects that the people are carrying behind this wall. Yeah. Then one of the prisoners manages to go out into the light. He escapes his shackles and he goes out and he suddenly sees things as they actually are. But first of all, because he's so blinded by the light, he can only look at the shadow of the sun or the reflection of the sun in water. So he looks at the world through the water and then gradually can see everything. And it's this dawning of what is the real reality, what is actually going on around us. And I think that's what's happened with COVID-19. I think that people who, go shopping every Saturday, never leave the city, don't ever think about, nature, they're not interested, it's all something that other people are interested in. Suddenly, the eating of endangered species, the traffic of endangered species, deforestation, all of these things have suddenly become a really scary reality for everybody because of what's happened. And it's just shifted us to a new level of consciousness. Now, obviously, there are people who are totally unaffected by this and just say, oh, we just want to get back to normal, we're not interested. That's inevitable. But when you're looking at the investment community, who are very enlightened anyway, I honestly think the finance community and the investment community are so ahead in their thinking, dare I say, probably more than some of the accounting bodies. I think that the finance community are so sharp, so forward thinking or whatever, and they've now grasped this issue. So I think biodiversity has been becoming an issue for the investment institutions over the last 18 months, and that came out in our interviews. But this has just suddenly catapulted the whole biodiversity issue into the centre of investment strategy and issues to do with the investment industry. And it's basically this idea of, Plato's shadow kingdom. Suddenly people who've been sitting looking at one version of reality where everything is okay are suddenly seeing that that's not the world we're living in. The world we're living in is terribly dangerous. We've got ecological threats to humanity, threats to human existence, etc. So that's really, in a sort of nutshell, what the theoretical part of the paper is about.
Right, perfect. Thank you very much. So to move on to our last segment, basically the outlook. Can you give us, again, in a nutshell, outlook where you think things are going to progress now in this area?
I think that this is absolutely crucial as an area for research. I think that enormous amounts, as we know, has been done on climate change, which is really important. Obviously, it's critically important. Climate change is a massive global threat, which we're not getting control of, as far as I can see, even though loads of efforts being made. But, hopefully the urgency of climate change will continue to be given attention. Unfortunately, COP26, everything's been put on hold because of COVID-19. But the way that I don't think I put this in the paper, but the way that I see biodiversity is very much a poor relation of climate change, because obviously they're connected. Biodiversity loss, species extinction are connected to climate change, but they're also very different. And the main drivers of biodiversity loss are deforestation, loss of habitat destruction, other ways like pollution, pesticides, all of the things that are contributing to species loss and species extinction. So that whole area is probably, in my mind, more important than climate change, at least as important, but certainly equally, if not more important, because it does threaten human continuation and survival, and, you know, is intricately connected with biodiversity, intricately connected with COVID-19. We can't continue seeing these things as separate, they're all interlinked. So all research which investigates ways of integrating these issues into the investment chain and into other parts of the financial markets, whether it's the banking sector, like the new Equator Principles of Incorporated Biodiversity, all of these mechanisms and governance mechanisms need to start to evolve around bringing these issues into the heart of the financial system. And we're working at the moment on a piece that I've written on extinction governance. So actually looking at corporate governance frameworks and integrating ecology and biodiversity into the heart of those frameworks as well. So that's...
All right, thank you. That's a very exciting outlook, and exciting in the sense that there's a lot of work being done in the area, not so exciting about the consequences that we are facing at the moment from from COVID-19 and the biodiversity crisis.
Absolutely, but I think it's important to have an optimistic viewpoint, that we have to try and say there are solutions. And I know that the work I'm doing with yourself as well, and with Martina McPherson, you know, our view is very much that we have to be optimistic. We can't just say, oh, everything's finished, it's all over. We have to actually keep trying to find ways of coming up with, as David Attenborough calls it, natural solutions or nature solutions.
Thank you very much, and thank you very much again for joining us for the second time, and especially with such an interesting and timely topic. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Chris. Thank you.